Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to discuss a little bit about some remarks by Ricardo Salinas, who is the third richest man in Mexico, regarding Bitcoin. And I'm going to dive into the three things that could take Bitcoin down. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relevance of that. I'm going to talk about investing philosophy, etc. And so hopefully it is very interesting for you. So just to get a little bit of background information. So Ricardo Salinas, like I said, third richest man in Mexico, recently came out with some comments, and Michael Saylor and some other people were retweeting this, that he said he figured all fiat currencies were a scam, and he wanted to hold Bitcoin over the next 30 years for preserving and growing generational wealth. Cool, okay, fair enough. And here's the interesting thing. There's a lot of really smart people who are saying kind of some similar things. Not just smart people, but very wealthy people, right? You have people like Tudor Jones saying, hey, listen, he wants at least, I think it's 5% in Bitcoin. He kind of lays out. You've got people like Stanley Druckenmiller, who's talking about buying and has bought Bitcoin. You've got Ray Dalio, who's now said he's got some Bitcoin. Obviously, many, many others. And so in this scenario, the thing is, okay, like what is the opposite case? Like in the event that all these people are interested in this, what are the things that can go wrong? What are the problems in this? And so I'm going to try and give you an analogy for understanding why this is relevant, how to kind of visualize the accretive element of Bitcoin. And then I'm going to talk about what I see as the major threats to that situation. Okay, if we haven't already, before we go on, please subscribe. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, hit the all notifications. I really appreciate your support. If you'd like help with any of the topics that we cover here, which is residencies, citizenships, international tax planning, forming companies, opening bank accounts, etc., basically doing business or relocating abroad, you can check out some of our videos, or you can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer, link in the description below. We try and help you with these things both on the strategy side as well as on the implementation side, or you can check out our website, offshorecitizen.net or offshorecapitalist.com, and you can send us a message through there. Okay, so here's a visualization for understanding the value of Bitcoin, okay? So think of Bitcoin like a big giant pot, okay? And why is this important? This is important because the amount of Bitcoins doesn't change, okay? And you can imagine that when people put money in, much like they use it like a bank account, right? So if you have a normal bank account, the bank account expands as people put more money in it. In the case of Bitcoin, it doesn't expand as people put more money in it. And what changed it, so instead of the pot expanding, the value of each coin goes up. So you can imagine them dumping water in, that's like depositing into this. And you can imagine the depth of water as being the amount of each Bitcoin, okay? So just kind of think of it that way. Now in practice, although the amount is fixed in theory way out there, there is a slight inflationary pressure each year, okay? So it's slightly growing at a what's called disinflationary rate, meaning that the rate of growth is decreasing until at some point it will hit zero and you will have a fixed number of Bitcoins, okay? And so if you just imagine more and more people are dumping water into this bucket, well, what's going to happen? The depth is going to go up and up, which is basically meaning that the value of it is going to go up and up. Now, sometimes people are taking the water out, some people are putting the water in. This is normal, but over time, there's some bigger and bigger people, such as Ricardo Salinas, such as Ray Dalio, such as Stanley Druckenmiller, such as Tudor Jones, such as Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy and Tesla, and Grayscale and PayPal and Stripe, or not Stripe, Square, et cetera, that are putting money into here, okay? And so it's forcing this to go up. Fair enough. Now, there's a little bit of a failure in this analogy in that price doesn't intrinsically match this water level. Why do I say this? I say this because you actually are competing on the float, meaning the amount that is available today, not the total amount that's available, okay? So because of that, you can cause the price to get bid up really aggressively in a very short period of time, which doesn't necessarily reflect the overall increase in depth. So you need to understand that, and this is one of the many reasons why you can have bubbles where the price can get ahead of basically the value, okay? Fair enough. Now, the whole point is that for the price of Bitcoin to go down, people need to take the water out, right? And so the question is, why would they take the water out? And I'm going to postulate to you what are, in my opinion, the three main reasons that this could happen, okay? So the first one is government regulation. And I'm going to speculate a little bit on the types of regulation that could take place. So the most extreme, of course, would be an all-out ban on Bitcoin, right? They could basically come out and they could say, hey, listen, it is illegal for businesses to transact in or have anything to do with Bitcoin. And the truth is that although it's decentralized, etc., if they made that a rule and they enforced that rule, most businesses would probably comply, right? Most people are not going to be so passionate about it, even though, to give you some idea, I think it was Paul Tudor Jones commented that as the price of Bitcoin fell after the last bull run from $20,000 to $3,000, something like 84% of people held. So it's almost a religious fervor to this extent. Like Bitcoin is as much a religion psychologically as it is an asset class, which is really quite a bizarre thing, right? Not normal in most scenarios. Anyway, so it's very interesting that people aren't selling. But if you were in a situation where they said, hey, listen, we're making it illegal, like it's punishable by jail time, etc., a lot of people are just going to step away from it. It's going to make it more difficult for people to buy, more difficult for them to sell. A lot of people are going to say, hey, listen, I don't want anything to do with it. And that would have a negative price pressure on Bitcoin. Now, I tend to believe that's not going to happen in a lot of the world. There may be some countries, like country by country, where they may do that. But for instance, if you look at the US, the number of people who have it already, who are major people, right? Major institutions who are getting involved, like JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, and like some of these big investment banks are providing Bitcoin-related services, custody services, because their clients are demanding it, right? And so if you come along and you kind of try and take away that revenue stream from them, if you go to, look, somebody like Ray Dalio is an influential guy, right? Runs the largest hedge fund in the world. If you go across the board, these people are going to be sending their lobbyists to Washington to say, whoa, don't do this. And realistically, probably the children and grandchildren of the politicians probably own this stuff. And so there's a lot of self-interest not to do an outright ban like that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that they would do that. What I think is much more likely is you just have to understand what is the environment in the US and a lot of these countries is an environment of corporatism, right? You've got this kind of nepotistic corporatist environment where lobbying is extremely powerful, where you've got certain institutions who feel that they have the right to make the money and they want to shut out competition. And they're facing a lot of competition right now. So the banks and the investment banks and the hedge funds and all these guys are going to go and lobby and they're going to say, hey, anyone who's handling Bitcoin should be a licensed financial institution. Like, doesn't it seem clear? You don't want somebody being in the Wild West. You don't want to have them laundering money. And so what's quite probable, I think, is that they will come out and they will say, hey, listen, you're welcome to hold these things, but only through a custodial solution that is licensed. That's like a fairly likely direction. It's one of the reasons why back when kind of what I figured kicked off this bull run was when PayPal started accepting Bitcoin or allowing people to buy Bitcoin. As I said, don't do that because you're kind of feeding into that. The whole point of Bitcoin, the whole value is the decentralization. And if you have centralized custodial control, then how is it different from any other stock or other asset that you can hold in a brokerage account? But I suspect that that is the direction they will go because there will be some very powerful forces who will want to capture fees off of that. Right now they can't capture any fees, right? So they're going to say, hey, you want to buy it? No problems. Use our services so we can generate money. And there's a lot of rent seeking going on. It's one of the terrible things in the Western world today is there's an increasing share of the economy taken up by rent seeking. So I suspect that they will go in that direction. Additionally, they could go and do things to try and regulate miners. We're going to talk about mining in a minute. So that's a possibility. They could say, hey, listen, or they could tax mining, right? Things that would kind of jeopardize how this all works, jeopardize the decentralized nature of it. They could do things like saying, hey, listen, we have to trace that these Bitcoins were produced from a green energy source. We're going to use a climate change argument to go after it. And as a result, only licensed green miners who we've guaranteed are actually using renewable power, only Bitcoins from there will we accept. And of course, then we can control it accordingly. Things like that, right? So the lack of complete fungibility of Bitcoin, what that means is that everyone is the same and it's equally interchangeable. Bitcoins aren't actually, they have a history. And so because of that, you can trace back to the source of what transactions it's been through. This one has been used in black market transactions. This one came from mining in China. This one came from mining in Iran. And they can basically separate out and say, hey, listen, not all Bitcoins are equal, and we're going to treat them differently. So you could end up with that type of thing pretty easily, okay? So let's just assume that there's some regulatory concerns that I think could have a nasty effect on Bitcoin. And not just nasty effect in terms of like the direct consequences. I think that they're going to allow it for sure. they're going to allow it as an investment product inside a brokerage account, right? But what can be negative about this is it can make it less competitive in the world of other technologies, because if you take away the things that make it powerful and say, hey, listen, it's just another investment product, it's just another asset in your brokerage account, then who cares, right? What's the point? And that's going to lead to an eventual migration to some other asset that seeks to achieve what Bitcoin achieves. This brings us to the second thing, which is competition, okay? In my opinion, competition is one of the most existential risks for Bitcoin. Lots of reasons why, if you were to design a new Bitcoin today, knowing what we know today, it wouldn't be designed the way it is, right? The consensus algorithm isn't that efficient. Obviously, it consumes a lot of power. There's something called self-mining that makes it less secure than you might expect. There's a bunch of different things that are kind of negative towards it. Obviously, the transaction speeds are low. The network scalability, the time to finality, lots of these things are problems on the Bitcoin network. And, they're trying to address them with layer 2 solutions like Lightning Network and, others. But that being said, there's a bunch of reasons to believe that this would possibly open the door to some other competitors. Because I look at it this way. There's a good chance that I've done a video before where I talked about wealth preservation and showing how, if you believe, and I don't think this is necessarily proven yet, but if you believe that Bitcoin is a counter-inflationary asset, meaning that as inflation rises, Bitcoin will adjust accordingly, which there's a logical reason to believe that. Whether it proves to be true or not is a whole other conversation. I think it's more a speculative asset at this stage, but we'll see. And then you would look and you would say, well, hang on a minute, I've got bonds. And so my normal wealth preservation, if I'm a big company, is to buy bonds, right? The problem is that the rate of interest is so low that it's virtually useless, and it doesn't keep up with inflation anymore. So I'm concerned about inflation, so I say, all right, let me mix my portfolio. Bonds are going to do well in deflation, so I'm going to hold some of them, and Bitcoin's going to do well in inflation. And if I compare it to some other assets that might do well in inflation, such as, let's say, gold, let's assume that gold keeps up with it. Again, I don't think that the counter-inflationary effects of gold are that well established at this point in time. I think that's been broken to a much larger extent than people pretend, but let's just assume that it's the case. Then you would say, okay, great. I can have greater volatility in Bitcoin, which from a risk parity standpoint means that I need less Bitcoin to balance my bonds than I would gold to balance my bonds. And maybe I'm going to use a mix, right? But the point is, it makes sense that you would allocate a portion of your portfolio there. Well, as soon as companies start doing that, then they start, gradually saying, well, hang on a minute, there's all these other technologies out there, like Ethereum, right? Now, right now, Ethereum is inflationary. There's no cap on the supply of Ethereum. And so as a result, it doesn't necessarily inherently solve that same problem, although a lot of other tokens do. But I tend to be a big believer in what's called the flippening. The flippening is the idea that Ethereum will overtake Bitcoin as the largest coin. And whether it's Ethereum specifically or some other token, I think that the fact that there's a value proposition behind this other token, like a lot more functionality, it's much more expressive, it's much more scalable, et cetera, means that inevitably over time, more money will flow there than will flow to Bitcoin, right? So if you get a bunch of people who start realizing, well, hang on a minute, I can get everything that I can get from Bitcoin, plus a whole bunch more from something like Ethereum, and Ethereum 2.0 has the possibility of actually being deflationary, maybe burning some of the token supply as they eliminated the coins, basically. Then in that scenario, it actually has better upward potential than Bitcoin does. And so in that environment, you start saying, well, hang on, why don't I just put it in there? And if you're using it to transact anyway, why would I ever switch back to Bitcoin, right? It's like there's this kind of weird trade-off. So I think that's a potentially existential threat. And there's a bunch of reasons you can get into for how this can become a problem with layer 2s as well, where basically what happens is, well, let's go on to this third one, because this third one is the best context for that. And so this third one is that you have a problem with the network that threatens the integrity of it. So the integrity of the network is threatened. And I see basically two scenarios under which this can happen. The first scenario is maybe most interesting, and I think from the perspective of China, they may have messed up on this. So imagine you're China, and you think, okay, well, I'm creating a digital yuan. I want that to be the global reserve currency, and I don't like people using Bitcoin. So what is the best way to get rid of Bitcoin? Is, I think, to threaten the security of Bitcoin. So the whole point of Bitcoin, why Bitcoin is seemingly valuable, is it's a secure network, right? Meaning that that record is immutable, you can access it, nobody can take it away from you, et cetera, right? Well, it only takes, at this point in time, in electricity, about $7 billion a year worth of electricity power to overpower the Bitcoin network in terms of the mining capacity. Now, the reality is that you can't just spend the money, because you also need the mining equipment, ASICs as they're called, mostly. You can do GPU mining and things like this as well, but basically you need the mining hardware. And until recently, a huge concentration of the mining hardware was in China. Now recently China basically kicked the miners out of China. I think that was probably a bad geopolitical move for them, because the smart thing to do if they wanted to go after the network would have been to say, hey, listen, let's cultivate it a lot here. Let's get lots of miners here. Then let's go and let's seize their mining facilities and let's run the mining against the network. And what you effectively could do is you could just produce an endless supply of empty blocks. You could gather the mining rewards. You could then turn around and you could dump those rewards back on the network. And if they tried to switch the network over, you could just likewise switch the network over. And there's lots of different, I think it would be a very difficult attack to counteract. Of course, you'd have community response and all this. But what would that do? That would, in my view, have a massive shaking effect on the world's belief in the security of Bitcoin, right? So right now, Bitcoin has never been hacked. Bitcoin has never had a 51% attack or something like this successfully. And so if you reached that stage where it did happen, you'd be like, oh boy, this could cause the price to crash like crazy, right? Along the same lines, L2s have kind of an existential threat in this sense, where increasingly the rewards for keeping the security of the network are paid from transaction fees as opposed to being paid from block rewards. This is kind of the theory, is that right now, as they mine, they get paid block rewards. This is basically the inflationary effect of Bitcoin gets paid to the miners. And over time, the idea is that the transaction fees are supposed to get paid instead. And you can kind of do a mathematical relationship between, okay, what are the block rewards worth versus what is the market cap of Bitcoin? And basically the block rewards being higher should cause more miners to come in, which should cause the system to have increased hash power, and the increased hash power protects the network. Basically, if you have more hash power than, or 51% of the hash power, actually technically it's less than that, but let's say 51%, then you can end up in a situation where you can overcome the network. Now, normally the structure of price, the relationship of price to hash power is such that it's going to tend to remain stable. But if you look at layer 2 solutions, what happens is you're moving, for example, you have wrapped BTC on the Ethereum network, you're talking about Lightning Network, taking a lot of these transactions off. So if the rewards aren't paid, or the mining fees aren't paid via block rewards, they're paid instead via transaction fees. And those transaction fees are mostly being paid off of the Bitcoin network, not on the Bitcoin network. It is possible that you can end up in another situation where the network would become vulnerable. So the point is, the third category of problems is that there's a weakness in the network that causes it not to be secure, that causes it to go down. And so those to me are the three risk categories that I can think of. I'd love to hear if you guys have some more to put in there that would cause a serious issue. And obviously, you know, there's varying degrees of, you know, you could take a lot of hash power offline temporarily. Obviously that could happen through terrorism or some sort of military attack or whatever else that would cause you to be able to fire up some mining and overcome it. Like there's all kinds of coordinated attacks that could take place. But if the security of the network was threatened, that could cause a lot of people to say, whoa, this is not safe anymore, I'm going to pull my money out. And as soon as they do that, that becomes a major issue. So anyway, would love to hear what you think. I hope that's a reasonable explanation for you. But in the absence of those, and I do think that all of these are, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're unlikely. I think in particular the second one is almost certain. But it's difficult to have it happen. It's a pretty challenging thing to have happen in the near future. So in the near future, it kind of is logical that the price would go up. Over time, I think systems that are going to be less affected by those problems are going to be in a better situation. So for example, proof of stake systems tend to be more resistant to this type of attack than proof of work systems. The reason being that if they do a soft fork on a proof of stake system to basically exclude the people who are doing this attack, then those people lost all their tokens, right? They're not useful on the new fork. And so you can just basically perpetually burn their resources. And so that's a negative effect for them. Whereas on proof of work, they can just keep redeploying onto whatever the new fork is and kind of reuse that power. So it's a much more difficult thing to protect against. So we'll see where that goes over time. There's pros and cons on either side, but that's a very interesting one. So I hope that's interesting to you. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. If not, please tell me why. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.